Number 10. Beirut. On August 4, 2020, the third largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded devastated over half the city of Beirut. More than 200 people were killed, many more were injured, and an estimated 300,000 people were left entirely homeless, with over 80,000 commercial, residential, and public areas damaged in the blast. With COVID, political and social upheaval, and economic collapse, the explosion robbed the city's structures of their cladding, frame, and glass parts, while ripping down other buildings, leaving nearly $15 billion in property damage. A year later, things became even worse for residents of Beirut. Everything in the city still reminds them of that day. Major issues remained unresolved, and no rescue or action plans were implemented by official institutions. Instead, civilians rallied to take rehabilitation efforts into their own hands. Today, Beirut relies heavily on human initiative and alternative governments to get things done. With no broader vision and government bodies failing to execute reforms in order to get international funding, the city looks like a tidier variation of what it once was. Essentially, streets are cleared of rubble and glass, buildings are shielded with plastic, and scaffolding is placed throughout the communities. Funds given to non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are insufficient to meet the massive needs brought up by the disaster, especially with the collapse of their economy and the high cost of materials. As a result, priority is given to sheltering individuals, sealing openings, partially repairing and installing windows and doors. Initiatives have come together to further drive rebuilding operations forward as far as possible given the conditions and to split the workload. From restoring residential and commercial units, partially for lower-income households and small businesses, to eventual full-fledged upgrades. Number 9. Galveston, Texas. Sunday, September 9, 1900 showed some of the most gruesome scenes people have ever seen. 3,000 homes, which was half of the residential part of Galveston, were completely washed away. Entire families went missing, and the exact number of casualties will never be known. Around 20,000 people were alive the day before, and on the 9th, not one single house stood. The aftermath of the storm was emotional. Officials tried to dump some bodies 18 miles into the Gulf of Mexico, but they eventually washed ashore. When this was discovered, the city's relief committee demanded they be cremated. Before the storm, the prosperous city of Galveston was one of the country's busiest ports. After the hurricane, it was hit with over $20 million in damages, which is more than $700 million in today's economy. Donations flooded in from New York's wealthy, as well as compassionate people from Germany and South Africa in the aftermath of the storm. Clara Barton, the Red Cross's 78-year-old founder, came 2 weeks later to reopen an orphanage in the area that had lost many people, and to manage the distribution of donated items, including loans to repair homes. Galveston had the difficult task of rebuilding. The town notably began construction on its distinctive seawall in 1902. Another critical problem required increasing the elevation of nearly 500 city blocks by 8 to 17 feet. Engineers surrounded 2 to 3 block areas with levees, and workers physically raised every structure, fence, streetcar track, utility, and water pipe using jack screws and stilts. As part of the grade lifting, more than 2,000 buildings were raised, requiring more than 15 million cubic yards of sand. Some of the structures remain intact, like the St. Patrick Catholic Church on 35th Street, which was lifted 5 feet with the help of 700 jacks. On August 8, 1910, the final cubic yard of sand was shoveled into position. Galveston was on the rise. The restoration would take 12 years, but it was considered worth the effort after a hurricane in 1915, when very few people were killed. Number 8. Dayton, Ohio. Dayton had a difficult month in March 1913. Over the Easter weekend, storms flooded the city for 3 days and nights. The runoff poured into the Great Miami River and its 3 tributaries, which meet in the city's business district, when the earth could no longer hold water and the severe rains persisted. Levees around the city began to fail after the 4th night of rain, and by 8 a.m. on March 25th, water was rushing through the streets. Flooding lasted nearly 18 hours. By the next morning, water was 20 feet deep downtown, and flames erupted after a gas explosion went unchecked since the region was inaccessible. More than 360 people were killed, 65,000 were displaced, 20,000 homes were damaged by flood and fire, and property damage totaled $2 billion in today's standards. A year later, much of the flood damage had been repaired, but Dayton's economy continued to suffer for another decade. The Miami Conservancy District was formed to prevent future tragedies. They created a flood control system capable of holding 140% of the water from the 1913 storm. Overpopulation was relieved by a rush to create emergency housing when suburban areas grew in World War II, but some of those houses are still occupied, even though they were supposed to be temporary. The population grew steadily over the next 40 years, but then began to drop as the city shifted away from significant manufacturing. Dayton is now Ohio's aerospace hub and has been named on multiple lists as one of the most economically diverse cities in the U.S. Number 7. White House Fire of 1814. The White House is commonly known as the President's House, but did you know that it burned to the ground in 1814? British forces entered Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812 and set fire to multiple buildings, including the President's House. British military officers dined in the vacant building after the victory before gutting it and torching it. After the Battle of Bladensburg, James Madison and his wife were able to escape safely. Madison took command of a battery during the conflict and is the only president to have fought while in office to this day. When British forces realized they couldn't hold the Capitol, they left. Madison returned the next day, intending to reconstruct the city. The Capitol building, the Library of Congress, and the House of Representatives were all also set on fire. Thankfully, heavy rain put the flames out before the historical sites were totally destroyed. The rebuilding of the White House was overseen by James Hoban, the architect of the original structure. President James Monroe moved into the new building in 1817, although it would be several years before the current version was built. The White House is still the same structure today, despite many repairs throughout the years. Number 6. Dresden. The eastern city of Dresden was reduced to ruins during the last winter of World War II, killing tens of thousands and sparking a fierce debate about whether the attack was justified. The bombing of Dresden began the night of February 13, 1945, when 796 British Lancaster and 9 Mosquito aircraft were displaced, dropping 1,478 tons of high explosives and 1,182 tons of incendiary bombs on the first bombing run and 800 tons on the second. 3 hours later, 535 Lancaster bombers dropped 1,800 tons of bombs. The next day, 311 American B-17 bombers dropped 771 tons of bombs on the streets. The Allied bombing techniques were designed to induce total destruction of buildings. High explosive bombs exposed the timber frames of buildings, incendiary bombs burnt the wood, and finally, assorted explosives negated firefighting attempts. The outcomes were disastrous. In Dresden's inner city, 24,866 of the 28,410 buildings were destroyed, many of which were schools, hospitals, and churches. Death toll estimates range from 25,000 to over 60,000. After World War II, the people of Dresden began the difficult process of clearing and reconstructing their cities. Volunteers spent years removing the rubble and carrying it away by hand. Many of the city's important historic buildings, like the Semper Opera House and the Zwinger Palace, were rebuilt. But city leaders chose to rebuild large areas of the city in a socialist modern style, partly due to economic reasons, but also to distance the city from its past as the royal capital of Saxony and a stronghold for the German bourgeoisie. Number 5. Tokyo. The Great Kanto earthquake struck Tokyo and Japan's second-largest city, Yokohama, on September 1, 1923, killing about 140,000 people. The tremor and many flames that followed wrecked 45% of Tokyo's metropolitan area. The spread of the damage mirrored the city's historical spatial structure. The flames were most devastating and fatal in Tokyo's densely built eastern half, the so-called Low City, or Shitamachi, where most commoners lived throughout the feudal period. The healthier and less densely populated old residential neighborhoods in the steep western half of the High City, or Yamanote region, survived the tragedy relatively untouched. As a result, urban planners discovered that huge urban green areas like Ueno Park functioned as a crucial protective barrier. They could also be used for temporary shelters for those that lost their homes. Despite a severely limited budget and opposition from local people, the 6-year rebuilding project successfully modernized Tokyo's core business district. A sensible roadway system with sidewalks was developed, as were contemporary bridges, tiny town squares, fireproof schools, public housing, and 3 major public parks, all in areas where there had previously been very little open space. Tragically, only 15 years later, in March 1945, significant areas of Tokyo were once again devastated, this time by incendiary bombing carried out by American B-29 bombers. Huge plans were made to reconstruct Tokyo, which would once again address the city's shortage of green space and provide a modern, comprehensive infrastructure system. For example, parks were to be given 10% of urban areas, and 100-meter-wide boulevards with huge promenades and linear parks would partition the city into clusters of 300,000 people each. An extensive land reorganization project tried to reorganize practically all of Tokyo outside the areas restored following the 1923 earthquake. Tokyo's metropolis has been entirely recreated not once, but many times in a single lifetime. Number 4. The Royal Exchange. The Great Fire of London was devastating, destroying nearly 80% of the city. Surprisingly, just 16 people are believed to have been killed in the fire. The Royal Exchange, a commercial trading center established after the Antwerp Stock Exchange by London merchant Sir Thomas Gresham, was among the buildings destroyed. Queen Elizabeth I inaugurated the Royal Exchange back in 1571. Since many of London's buildings and homes were built during medieval times, the fire spread incredibly fast. Because oak lumber was the predominant structural material, many of the poorer homes were tar-coated to keep rain out, and unfortunately, this meant they were very flammable. The Royal Exchange had grown so important to business by 1666 that it had to be restored with the rest of the burnt city. King Charles II laid the foundation blocks for one of the columns and celebrated with a great feast, allegedly giving the workmen 20 pounds of gold. After the plans of Christopher Wren, who oversaw the repair operations, fell through, Mr. German, a city surveyor, designed the reconstruction. Workers finished the structure in 1669, and it served as a trading hub for another 170 years, until disaster struck again. On January 10, 1838, the building caught on fire again, this time thanks to an overheated stove in Lloyd's coffee shop. The fire department's reaction was delayed because the building's gates had to be pushed open and the nearest fire engine was frozen solid. Sir William Tite developed the third version of the Royal Exchange. Tite's design was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. Workers discovered the remains of an old Roman courtyard while excavating the property. These relics were brought to the Guildhall's Corporation Museum. Queen Victoria later opened it up in October 1844. The Royal Exchange is modeled after the Roman designs that served as inspiration, and it also incorporates Italian Renaissance art. The renovated and revamped site, now a well-known tourist destination, remains today and houses a variety of high-end retail businesses. Number 3. Warsaw. In a spiteful act of retaliation after the Warsaw Uprising, enraged Germans methodically demolished the city of Warsaw. They destroyed 80 to 90% of the city's once beautiful structures and monuments. The majority of the damage to other European cities occurred during the conflict, but Warsaw was devastated after the fact. The city's iconic museums, art galleries, theaters, churches, parks, and historical structures like their castles and palaces were all gone. After the war, the people of Poland refused to recognize that their cultural legacy had been lost. In one of history's major rebuilding projects, the Polish tried to restore their fallen city during the 1950s and 1970s. For a period of time, Warsaw residents had to live in the ruins. It was even proposed that the city's eerie ruins be left to remember the battle and the capital be transferred somewhere else. But the Poles were determined to re-establish their historic capital. They salvaged as much rubble and genuine old town building materials as they could. Locals assisted construction workers and specialist builders in reviving their city. The majority of the work was finished by 1955, just 10 years after the war. Most of the old town has been preserved, but there were a few small mistakes. As a gift from the Soviet Union, the Palace of Culture and Science was rebuilt in 1955. Reconstruction work continued until the 1980s, and the old town was eventually completely rebuilt. Warsaw's new town was only partially reconstructed. When restoration began, multiple officials wanted the skyline to replicate the pre-war era rather than add modern details. In the mid to late 1700s, an Italian painter named Bernardo Bellotto came to paint scenes of Warsaw life. His efforts aided in the reconstruction of important neighborhoods. Bellotto painted 22 street scenes of old Warsaw, and throughout the years, Germany, Napoleon, and Russian Emperor Nicholas I stole his canvases as they became highly sought after. Thankfully, all 22 of his street scenes survived in the war. They can now be seen in the Canaletto Chamber of the Royal Castle. Number 2. Greensburg, Kansas. On the night of May 4, 2007, Greensburg locals were faced with a harsh weather event, the strongest tornado in nearly a decade. When an EF5 tornado, the most damaging on the enhanced Fujita scale, hit the town of 1,265 and traveled 22 miles, striking Main Street, the city center, and nearby homes, schools, and businesses, killing 11 people and injuring 63. By the time the dust settled, the tornado had destroyed 95% of the western Kansas town and caused $268 million in damage. After the tornado, the Greensburg City Council committed to reconstructing the town in line with the principles of the LEED Green Building Certification Program, making the city the first in the country to take such an action. They worked non-stop, and it paid off. The city is now mostly powered by wind and solar energy. The hospital and city hall in Greensburg have the highest LEED certification, and the city is still striving to get all of its buildings certified to this level. Greensburg, resurrected, can today boldly claim to be one of the country's greenest cities. Number 1. The Great Chicago Fire. On October 8, 1871, a fire broke out in a Chicago barn owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. It unleashed a 2-day fire, killing somewhere between 200 and 300 people, destroying 17,450 structures, rendering 100,000 people homeless, and costing nearly $200 million. That's nearly $4 billion today. According to legend, a cow simply kicked over a light in the O'Leary barn and caused the fire, but other hypotheses say that people or possibly a comet were to blame. The disaster destroyed 4 square miles of Chicago, including its business area. Chicago was prone to fires because of its dry weather and the amount of timber buildings, streets, and walkways. The Great Chicago Fire spawned a movement that became known as the Great Rebuilding. This renaissance gave rise to new types of heat-resistant structures made of fireproof materials like brick, stone, marble, and terracotta roof tiles. It marked the birth of the Chicago School, a group of architects who created strong high-rises with plenty of natural light, neoclassical components, and minimal adornment. The modern skyscrapers that now dominate Chicago and other major cities were significantly influenced by Chicago School architects like William LeBaron Jenney and Louis Sullivan. Thanks for watching. What did you think of these cities that had to be rebuilt? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.